Diddy finally reacted to facing murder charges for the Tupac hit, and what he said has the entire hip-hop world shaking. For nearly 3 decades, the question of who ordered Tupac's killing hung in the air like a ghost nobody could put to rest. Now, with the Las Vegas murder trial finally underway and Diddy's name being dragged directly into the courtroom conversation, the man himself could no longer stay silent. He is already locked up on separate federal charges. His empire has already collapsed. And now the allegation that he bankrolled $1 million hit on Tupac Shakur has come roaring back into public view with more legal force behind it than at any point in the last 30 years. These are not rumors. This is a criminal proceeding, and Diddy's reaction to it tells you everything about how desperate this situation has become. Stay with us, because the full story of how Sean Combs ended up connected to one of the most infamous murders in music history is darker and more complicated than anything you have seen in the headlines. But real quick, if you're serious about winning in the rap game, I put everything I know into one ebook. I'm talking how to actually grow an audience from zero, how to get labels reaching out to you with deals, and even how to get paid in this industry without ever touching a mic. And nah, it's not too late. People love to say the wave passed. It didn't. New artists and new hustlers are blowing up every single day, and the ones eating are the ones who started now instead of waiting. It's only $14.99. That's a few cups of coffee for a blueprint that can change how you move in this game forever. Links in the description bio. Go grab it. Then let's get back to the video. Yo, what's good, fam? Today we are diving into Diddy's potential murder charges connected to the Tupac hit, how the Keffe D trial brought his name back into the spotlight, the full story of the East Coast-West Coast rivalry that started it all, and why nearly 30 years later, this case is finally inside a courtroom. Let's get into it. The only person ever criminally charged in connection with Tupac Shakur's 1996 murder is Duane Davis. Better known as Keffe D. Davis, is a former gang leader from Compton, California, a one-time member of the Southside Crips, and the man Nevada prosecutors describe as the mastermind behind the drive-by shooting that took Tupac's life on September 7, 1996. He was arrested in September 2023 after decades of what investigators described as reinvigorating statements he made publicly, including in interviews, documentaries, a podcast, and his own memoir titled Compton Street Legend, where he detailed events surrounding Tupac's death in striking detail. He has been held at the Clark County Detention Center since his arrest, without successfully posting bail. He has pleaded not guilty to first-degree murder with use of a deadly weapon and a gang enhancement, and his murder trial was scheduled to begin in Las Vegas on February 9, 2026, after multiple delays. Now here is where it gets real, fam, because what Keffe D has said publicly about the night Tupac died is not simply about his own alleged role in the shooting. According to claims attributed to Davis over the years, the retaliation that led to Tupac's death had a financial backer. Someone on the East Coast side of the rivalry, according to Davis, allegedly offered $1 million for an attack targeting Tupac and Death Row Records boss Marion Suge Knight. And the name Davis has pointed toward is Sean Combs, known to the world as Diddy, the founder and head of Bad Boy Records. Let that sit for a minute, because if that allegation carried any legal weight, it would mean the murder of one of the greatest rappers who ever lived was not simply street retaliation over a casino lobby confrontation. It would mean the killing had a financial engine behind it, rooted in the East Coast versus West Coast rivalry that consumed hip-hop in the mid-1990s. Now, before y'all start treating that as established fact, we have to be very clear about something. Diddy has not been charged with Tupac's murder. There is no murder indictment against Sean Combs in connection with the 1996 shooting. The allegation linking him to that supposed $1 million bounty comes from Keffe D, a man who is himself facing a first-degree murder charge and who has every reason to shape his account in ways that serve his defense, shift blame elsewhere, or position himself as someone who was simply a conduit for bigger forces rather than the mastermind prosecutors say he is. When you evaluate a source, you have to consider their motive and their consistency. Keffe D has told this story across documentaries, podcasts, his memoir, and conversations with investigators over many years, and the details have not always lined up perfectly. He also went on record in early 2026 from jail, claiming he had been just trying to make money when he gave those earlier interviews. That is a significant admission. It raises real questions about how much of what he said over the years was truthful recollection, and how much was shaped to generate attention and income. Diddy has strongly denied any involvement in Tupac's murder and has pushed back against these allegations repeatedly. His legal team has questioned Keffe D's credibility directly and argued that statements from an accused murderer should be treated with the skepticism they deserve. All of that matters, but it does not stop the conversation from raging, and it does not stop investigators and the public from asking what, if anything, the trial could surface that was never fully examined before. To understand why Diddy's name keeps coming up, you have to go back to the beginning. And the beginning of this story is not a drive-by in Las Vegas. It starts years earlier in a rivalry that defined an entire era of American music. In the early and mid-90s, the geography of hip-hop was shifting in real time. New York had been the undisputed capital of the genre for years, built on the sounds of the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Queens, and carried forward by acts that included the notorious B.I.G. and the Bad Boy Records empire that Diddy was building around him. Puff Daddy, as he was known then, was one of the most ambitious figures the music industry had ever produced. A man who understood not just how to make hits, but how to build a brand, how to position artists, and how to make the business of hip-hop feel glamorous and aspirational at a time when the culture was exploding into mainstream consciousness. But out west, Death Row Records under Suge Knight was producing something that felt different and hit different. Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, and most explosively, Tupac Shakur, who signed to Death Row in 1995 after Suge Knight famously arranged his release from prison, were creating records that carried a different kind of energy and a different kind of attitude. Death Row was raw, aggressive, confrontational, and unapologetically street in a way that stood in stark contrast to the polished commercial sound that Bad Boy had perfected. Suge Knight himself was a physically imposing figure who ran his label with an iron grip and had very little patience for the diplomatic approach to music industry politics that Diddy represented. These were not simply competing record labels. They were competing visions of what hip-hop was supposed to be, what it was allowed to say, and who got to define it. And the men running those labels had very different ideas about each other. Tupac and Biggie had actually been on friendly terms in the early days. Tupac later described Biggie as someone he considered a genuine friend and a genuine peer. But that changed on the night of November 30th, 1994, in what became known as the Quad Studios shooting. Tupac was shot 5 times in the lobby of Quad Recording Studios in Manhattan, robbed of his jewelry, and somehow survived. Biggie and Diddy were in the building that night, working in the studio. Let me be clear, their presence in the building did not make them responsible for the shooting. But Tupac, lying in a hospital bed after surviving something that should have killed him, began to believe that people he trusted had known something was coming and had not warned him. He became convinced, rightly or wrongly, that people around the Bad Boy camp had information about what happened that night and had stayed silent about it. That belief, whether accurate or not, transformed a personal friendship into one of the most dangerous feuds in music history. The bitterness that followed the Quad Studios shooting metastasized publicly in a series of moves that kept escalating the stakes. The 1995 Source Awards in New York became a flashpoint that nobody in that room ever forgot. Suge Knight took the stage and threw what many interpreted as a direct jab at Diddy and Bad Boy's style of executive involvement in recordings, suggesting that artists should sign to labels where the executives stayed off camera and off records. The crowd in that room, a predominantly New York crowd, booed loudly. It was a public humiliation delivered on one of the biggest stages the industry had, and it announced that the 2 most powerful labels on opposite sides of the country were not going to pretend to get along. And Diddy was not passive in all of this. He was one of the most competitive figures in the music business, and the idea that Death Row and Suge Knight were threatening his dominance over the direction of the industry was something he took personally. Diddy publicly pushed back on the narrative that Bad Boy was soft or that he was hiding behind his artists. He defended his label, defended Biggie, and made clear that whatever was being said from the West Coast side of this rivalry was not going unanswered. The tension between Diddy and Suge Knight was not simply about music. It was about money, power, and which coast was going to define what mainstream success in this genre looked like for the next decade. Biggie sat at the center of that tension as the biggest artist on Bad Boy, and his loyalty to Diddy made him a target in ways that ultimately proved fatal. When Tupac did sign to Death Row in late 1995, the rivalry that had felt like a music industry dispute started feeling like something with real stakes and real consequences. Tupac spent 1995 and 1996 on Death Row, recording at a relentless pace, releasing material that directly addressed the feud. He gave interviews accusing Diddy and the bad boy world of knowing about the Quad Studios attack. He said things publicly that most artists would only say in private. The escalation on his end was not the measured response of someone playing chess. It was the response of someone who believed he was already in a war. The diss track known as Hit 'Em Up became the defining document of the feud. Released in 1996, the record was one of the most aggressive and explicit attacks in hip-hop history, targeting Biggie, Bad Boy, and figures in and around that world with a level of personal venom that made every other diss track sound polite by comparison. Without reproducing the lyrics, what the record communicated was unmistakable. This was not professional competition between rival labels. This was a declaration of war from a man who believed he had been betrayed and left for dead, and who had the platform and the confidence to say exactly that to millions of listeners. The track set the temperature of the rivalry at a level where any confrontation between the two camps felt like it could escalate beyond music, and it did. And then came September 7th, 1996. Tupac attended the Mike Tyson vs. Bruce Seldon fight at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas, alongside Suge Knight and a death row entourage. At some point after the fight, a confrontation broke out in the hotel lobby involving Orlando Anderson, Keffe D's nephew, and a member of the Southside Crips. According to prosecutors, members of the death row camp, including Tupac, were involved in the physical altercation with Anderson. That confrontation, according to the prosecution's theory of the case, became the motive for what happened later that evening. Tupac left the MGM Grand in a BMW driven by Suge Knight, heading toward a night out that never happened. A white Cadillac pulled alongside the vehicle at a traffic stop near Flamingo Road, as shots were fired into the BMW. Tupac was struck multiple times. He was rushed to the University Medical Center of Southern Nevada, where he fought for 6 days before dying on September 13, 1996, at 25 years old. Keffe D has claimed publicly that he was in the front passenger seat of that Cadillac. He has said his nephew Orlando Anderson, who died in an unrelated shooting in 1998, was in the back seat and was the shooter. He has also, across various interviews and his memoir, connected the retaliation to an alleged promise of financial support from the bad boy side of the rivalry. That is where the alleged $1 million bounty enters the story. According to Davis, Diddy had allegedly offered that money for an attack targeting Tupac and Suge Knight, and the expectation of that payment played a role in what happened in Las Vegas. Again, this is Keffe D's claim. It has not been established as fact in a court of law. It has not been corroborated in a way that would allow prosecutors to file charges against Diddy based on it. And it comes from a man with every reason to shape his own account in ways that serve his defense, or shift responsibility onto others. What federal investigators did do in the years following Tupac's murder is conduct surveillance related to Keffe D and examine whether evidence connected Bad Boy Records to the shooting. The FBI conducted an undercover operation that included recordings and interviews with individuals connected to the case. But it apparently did not produce actionable evidence directly tying Diddy to the murder. The absence of charges does not mean investigators concluded Diddy was innocent. It means the standard required to charge and prosecute someone was not met by the evidence available at that time. Those are two very different things. Here is where the legal landscape gets important for y'all to understand. There is a massive difference between an allegation and a criminal charge. An allegation is what someone claims happened. An indictment requires a grand jury to find the evidence sufficient to proceed to trial. A conviction requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Keffe D's statements about Diddy are an allegation. They may generate investigative attention. But between that allegation and a murder charge against Diddy, there are several significant legal and evidentiary thresholds that have not been crossed. Now the fact that Diddy is already incarcerated on separate federal charges is something a lot of people are collapsing into this conversation in ways that create confusion. His current incarceration involves federal offenses that are completely unrelated to Tupac's murder. The existence of those charges does not make him guilty of anything involving Tupac. These are legally distinct cases, and treating them as one story simply because they involve the same person is exactly the kind of shortcut that keeps people from understanding what is actually happening. But here is what the real kicker is in all of this. Tupac's murder is one of the most famous unsolved crimes in the history of American popular culture. The case went without a single arrest for 27 years. When Keffe D was finally indicted in 2023, it was the first time anyone had ever been criminally charged in connection with the killing. The trial that began in Las Vegas in early 2026 is the first time this case has ever been in front of a jury. That is not just a legal proceeding. That is a cultural moment that has been 3 decades in the making. And in that courtroom, evidence, testimony, historical statements, recordings, and documents are being presented and examined in a way they never have been before. If that process surfaces information that genuinely implicates additional individuals in a legally meaningful way, investigators could theoretically pursue those leads, but that possibility is not a foregone conclusion, and it should not be treated as one. Let us go back to the relationship between Diddy and Tupac one more time, because the personal dimension of this story matters as much as the legal one. These were 2 men who moved in overlapping circles during one of the most creative and volatile periods in music history. Tupac's fury toward Bad Boy and the people around it was not manufactured for marketing purposes or carefully calculated to boost record sales. It came from a place that felt real to him, from a belief that he had been betrayed at the most vulnerable moment of his life, lying shot on the floor of a Manhattan recording studio. Whether that belief was accurate is something that has never been established in a courtroom or through independent investigation. What is certain is that it drove him to make statements publicly and privately that turned a music industry conflict into something that felt deeply personal and dangerously unpredictable. The tragedy at the core of this story is not simply that 2 great artists died young. It is that the path from a friendship, a genuine friendship between Tupac and Biggie that produced mutual respect and real affection, to a feud that ended in 2 unsolved murders, was paved with suspicion, misunderstanding, ego, money, regional identity, and the combustible environment that the music industry of that era created around its biggest stars. Diddy was not simply a bystander in that environment. He was one of its architects. Whether he was also something more sinister in relation to Tupac's death is the question that has never been answered. And it is the question that the current legal proceedings have brought back to the surface with more force than any prior examination ever has. Biggie's death several months later in March 1997, another unsolved drive-by shooting in Los Angeles, cemented the mythology surrounding the East Coast-West Coast war in a way that has never faded. 2 of the greatest rappers who ever lived, both dead before they turned 30, in a conflict that started as a music industry rivalry and ended as something far darker. The deaths of Tupac and Biggie transformed what had been a business dispute into something that carried genuine grief and genuine unanswered questions that millions of people have carried for nearly 3 decades. And at the center of both stories, in different ways and to different degrees, the name Diddy appears not as a convicted criminal, but as a figure whose proximity to the most painful chapter in hip-hop history has never been fully resolved. He built the most successful commercial rap empire of the 90s. He lost his closest artist and collaborator when Biggie was killed. He spent years carrying the public weight of a feud that ended in multiple deaths. Whatever his actual involvement or non-involvement in the events of 1996, he has never been able to fully step outside the shadow of what happened. And now, in 2026, with a different set of legal problems already surrounding him, that shadow has returned in a way that is inescapable. What the Keffe D trial represents is something unprecedented in the history of this case, and that matters for everyone who has spent any part of the last 3 decades wondering what actually happened. For the first time, a jury is being asked to sit with the evidence and determine what can actually be established about Tupac's death. Testimony is being scrutinized by lawyers on both sides with every incentive to poke holes in the narrative being presented. Historical statements made by the accused are being examined for inconsistencies, exaggerations, and shifts in detail that reveal where the account may have been shaped by personal interests rather than memory. Documents, recordings, and other evidence are being presented in a formal legal setting, where rules of evidence govern what the jury actually gets to hear and what gets excluded. The version of events that Keffe D described in interviews, in his memoir, in conversations with investigators over many years is being tested against everything else that can be verified or challenged. And what comes out of that process, whatever the verdict ultimately is, could change the public understanding of what happened in Las Vegas on September 7, 1996, in ways that 27 years of speculation, documentaries, podcasts, and viral videos never could. The families of Tupac and Biggie have lived with unanswered questions for nearly 30 years, and no documentary or internet theory has given them what a court of law can potentially provide: a formal determination backed by evidence that has been challenged and tested. The trial does not automatically answer all of those questions, but it creates a formal record where at least some of what has only existed as allegation has to be evaluated against a real evidentiary standard. The central question of this documentary is the one the internet keeps asking, and it deserves a straight answer. Based on everything that is currently known, Diddy has not been charged with Tupac's murder. He is not facing a murder indictment in a Las Vegas case. The title of this video uses the word facing, and that word is doing a lot of work. Facing renewed scrutiny is real. Facing renewed allegations is real. Facing a public conversation that has reopened one of the most explosive chapters in his life story is absolutely real. But facing formal murder charges for Tupac's death, as of the current information, is not what is happening. That distinction matters enormously. Not because Diddy deserves to have his reputation protected at the expense of the truth, but because treating allegations as convictions before evidence is tested in court is exactly how justice gets distorted. The reason the Keffe D trial matters so much is precisely because it forces at least part of this story into an environment where evidence has to be evaluated, rather than simply believed. That does not guarantee truth. Trials are imperfect. But it is closer to truth than anything that has come before it in this particular case. At the end of the day, fam, what we are watching unfold in real time is the slow and complicated machinery of the legal system finally getting to work on a case that should have been resolved decades ago. Keffe D is in a Las Vegas courtroom. The allegations about Diddy are part of the public record. Investigators who had this case open for nearly 3 decades have more information on the table now than at any previous point. And Tupac's family, his fans, and everyone who grew up with his music deserves a process that actually tests the evidence rather than one that settles for mythology. The most important word in the title is not Diddy, it is not Tupac. The most important word is facing, because what we are watching is not the conclusion of this story. It is the moment where the truth finally has to show up in a room where it can be cross-examined, challenged, and verified. After nearly 30 years, that moment is finally here. And what the courtroom reveals matters a whole lot more than what the internet has already decided. Drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe, because as this trial develops, we will be right here breaking down every new development as it comes.